Captain Marcus Reed had sailed the Mediterranean for 23 years, but he had never encountered anything like the storm that struck his cargo vessel on that October evening. The Meridian Explorer groaned under the assault of 40-foot waves, her steel hull shuddering with each impact. Rain lashed the deck like bullets, and the wind howled with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. "Captain, we're taking on water in the forward compartment," shouted First Officer Sarah Chan, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She gripped the bridge railing, her knuckles white against the metal as the ship pitched violently to starboard. Marcus fought to maintain his footing, his weathered hands steady on the wheel despite the circumstances. His crew of 18 had weathered storms before, but this one felt different. The air itself seemed charged with an energy that made his skin crawl, and the compass spun wildly, as if confused by some unseen force. "Deploy emergency pumps," he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the storm's roar. "Rodriguez, get down there and assess the damage. Chen, radio the Coast Guard and give them our position." The ship's cook, a stocky man named Paolo Vitelli, stumbled onto the bridge, his usually pristine white apron soaked with seawater. "Captain, something's wrong with the galley. The water coming in, it's warm. Almost hot. And there's a strange smell." Before Marcus could respond, a massive wave crashed over the bow, sending torrents of water cascading across the deck. But this wave was different. It glowed with a phosphorescent light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and steam rose from where it touched the cold metal of the ship. "What in God's name?" Marcus muttered, staring at the luminous water draining from the deck. In his decades at sea, he had witnessed many phenomena, from St. Elmo's fire to waterspouts, but nothing had prepared him for this. The storm raged for 3 more hours, battering the Meridian Explorer relentlessly. By the time it finally began to subside, the ship had drifted far off course, pushed by currents that didn't appear on any chart. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the damage, welding patches over hull breaches and pumping out the flooded compartments. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, an eerie calm settled over the water. The sea, which had been a churning maelstrom just hours before, now lay as smooth as glass. Wisps of mist rose from the surface, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the crew speak in hushed tones. "Captain, you need to see this," called Miguel Rodriguez from the bow. The ship's engineer stood at the railing, pointing toward a small island that had appeared as if from nowhere. The landmass was roughly circular, perhaps half a mile across, with steep cliffs rising from the water. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't the island itself, it was the color of the water surrounding it. The sea around the island glowed with the same phosphorescent light they had seen during the storm. The water seemed to pulse and swirl in patterns that defied explanation, creating spirals of blue-green luminescence that stretched down into the depths. "I've never seen that island on any chart," Sarah said, consulting her navigation equipment. "GPS shows we're in the middle of empty ocean, but there it is, clear as day." Marcus studied the mysterious landmass through his binoculars. The island appeared to be volcanic in origin, with dark rock formations jutting skyward like ancient spears. Vegetation covered the upper slopes, thick, tropical growth that seemed unusually vibrant for this part of the Mediterranean. And there was something else, something that made him adjust the focus of his binoculars for a better look. "There's smoke," he announced. "Coming from the interior. Could be volcanic activity, but it looks more like campfires." The crew gathered at the railing, straining to see what their captain had spotted. Indeed, thin columns of smoke rose from various points on the island, too regular and dispersed to be natural phenomena. "Should we investigate?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea. Marcus considered their options. The ship had suffered significant damage, and they were already behind schedule with their cargo of electronics bound for Istanbul. But maritime law required them to investigate any signs of human activity, especially in uncharted waters. There could be survivors from another vessel, or researchers who needed assistance. "We'll anchor offshore and send a landing party," he decided. "Rodriguez, prep the Zodiac. Chen, you're with me. Paulo, monitor the radio and be ready to call for backup if needed." An hour later, Marcus found himself piloting the inflatable boat toward the island's shoreline. The phosphorescent water seemed to part before their bow, creating ripples of light that followed them like a wake of stars. Sarah sat in the stern, checking her equipment and trying to maintain her composure despite the strangeness of their situation. "Captain," she said quietly, "the water temperature is reading 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For October in the Mediterranean, that's at least 15 degrees too warm." Marcus nodded grimly. Everything about this place defied explanation, from its sudden appearance to the glowing sea that surrounded it. As they approached the shore, he could see that the beach was composed of black sand that sparkled with flecks of what looked like gold or copper. They pulled the Zodiac onto the beach, its keel grinding against the unusual sand with a musical tinkling sound. The moment Marcus stepped onto dry land, he felt it, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the island itself. It was subtle but unmistakable, like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the rock. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, kneeling to touch the sand. "It's like the whole island is alive." The vegetation that surrounded the beach was unlike anything Marcus had seen in the Mediterranean. Palm-like trees with broad, silvery leaves rustled in a breeze that didn't seem to affect anything else. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors, deep purples that seemed to absorb light, and blues so vivid they hurt to look at directly. They followed a narrow path that wound up from the beach, marked by smooth stones that had been obviously placed by human hands. The trail was well maintained, free of overgrowth, suggesting recent use. As they climbed, the sounds of the island began to emerge from the initial silence. Birds called from the canopy above, but their songs were strange and haunting, unlike any species Marcus could identify. There were other sounds too, rustlings in the undergrowth, the distant splash of water, and something else that made him pause. It sounded almost like singing, but too deep and resonant to be human voices. "Captain, look at this," Sarah called from a few yards ahead. She stood beside what appeared to be a stone marker, carved with symbols that were clearly not any known alphabet. The characters seemed to flow and curve in patterns that were both beautiful and unsettling. Marcus examined the carving, running his fingers over the smooth stone. The symbols were deep-cut and weathered, suggesting great age, yet the marker itself seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the island's heartbeat. "Ancient Greek, maybe?" Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "No," Marcus replied slowly. "This is something else entirely. Something much older." They continued up the path, the mystery deepening with each step. The temperature grew warmer as they climbed, and the air took on a sweet, almost intoxicating quality. Marcus found himself feeling strangely energized, as if the very atmosphere of the island was revitalizing his aging body. After 30 minutes of steady climbing, they emerged into a clearing that took their breath away. Before them lay a perfectly circular pool, perhaps 50 feet across, filled with water that glowed with the same phosphorescent light they had seen in the ocean. The pool was surrounded by more stone markers, these ones larger and more elaborate than the one they had encountered on the path. But what truly amazed them was the architecture visible on the far side of the clearing. Rising from the tropical vegetation were structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape. They were constructed from the same dark stone as the cliffs, but shaped with such artistry and precision that they appeared almost organic, as if they had grown rather than been built. "My God," Sarah breathed. "How long do you think this place has been inhabited?" Before Marcus could answer, they heard it clearly, the singing they had detected earlier, now unmistakably emanating from the direction of the structures. The voices were deep and harmonious, creating a chord that seemed to resonate with the very stones beneath their feet. "We should go back," Sarah said suddenly, her scientific curiosity warring with a primitive instinct for caution. "Report what we've found and let the authorities handle this." But Marcus was already moving toward the sound, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The singing grew louder as they approached the first building, and he could see flickering lights through what appeared to be windows or openings in the stone walls. As they rounded the structure, they came upon a sight that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. In a courtyard surrounded by the organic architecture, a group of figures moved in a slow, ritualistic dance around a central fire. At first glance, they appeared human, tall and graceful, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the firelight. But, as Marcus watched, he realized that their proportions were subtly wrong, their limbs too long, their heads too large. And their eyes reflected the firelight like polished mirrors, showing no whites or irises, just endless depth that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. One of the dancers noticed their presence and raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning. The singing stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence was deafening. All of the figures turned to regard the two humans, their mirror eyes reflecting not just light but what seemed like surprise and concern. The apparent leader of the group stepped forward, moving with a fluid grace that defied human limitation. When it spoke, its voice carried the same resonant quality as their singing, though the words were in accented English. "Travelers from the surface waters," it said, the syllables flowing like music. "You should not have come to this sacred place during the time of awakening." Marcus found his voice, though his throat felt dry as sand. "We're sorry for intruding. Our ship was damaged in the storm. We saw smoke and came to investigate, thinking there might be people in need of help." The being's expression, if it could be called an expression, seemed to soften slightly. "Your intentions honor you, surface dweller. But you have arrived at a moment of great significance, when the ancient compact between our peoples hangs in the balance." "Ancient compact?" Sarah whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the crystalline air. "Long ago, when your kind first ventured upon the deep waters, an agreement was made. Your ships would pass safely over our realm, and we would remain hidden in the depths and secret places. But times change, and the old treaties grow weak." As the being spoke, Marcus became aware of movement in the shadows around the courtyard. More figures emerged from the structures, and he realized with growing amazement that there were dozens of them. Men, women, and children? The smaller figures moved with the same impossible grace, their eyes holding the same ageless depth. "What are you?" Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected an answer that his rational mind rejected. "We are the Merethi," the leader replied. "Guardians of the deep places, keepers of the ancient ways. What you call dragonfolk in your oldest stories and songs." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Dragons. The stuff of legend and fantasy, yet here he stood in their presence, watching firelight dance across scales that masqueraded his skin, listening to voices that carried the power of ocean storms. "The awakening we perform tonight," the leader continued, "celebrates the hatching of a new generation. The first in 7 centuries. It is a sign that our people will endure, despite the changing world above." As if summoned by these words, a procession emerged from the largest of the structures. Several of the dragonfolk carried what appeared to be large eggs, their surfaces reflecting the firelight in swirling patterns of color. But it was the smallest of the carriers that drew Marcus's attention, a young dragon being, perhaps equivalent to a human teenager, cradling something much smaller than the others. "The late hatchling," the leader explained, following Marcus's gaze. "It emerged just as your ship arrived in our waters. A moment of great significance, for it is said that when a hatchling greets the surface world at its birth, great changes will follow." The young dragon being approached them, moving with careful steps. In its arms was a creature no larger than a house cat, with scales that shifted color in the firelight, now deep blue, now silver, now a green so pure it seemed to capture the essence of growing things. The hatchling's eyes were proportionally large for its head, and they held the same mirror-like quality as its elders, but with an additional spark that Marcus could only describe as curiosity. It made soft chirping sounds, almost like a bird, but with an undertone that suggested intelligence far beyond any animal. "It wishes to see you more clearly," the young carrier said, its voice carrying the musical quality of all its kind, but higher and clearer. "Hatchlings born during surface storms often show great interest in the upper world." Sarah stepped back instinctively, but Marcus found himself drawn forward. The hatchling stretched out one tiny arm toward him, its movements deliberate and purposeful. When Marcus extended his own hand, the small creature touched his finger with what might have been the dragon equivalent of a child's exploratory grab. The moment of contact sent a shock through Marcus's system, not painful, but transformative. For an instant, he experienced sensation beyond human comprehension, the feeling of water as a three-dimensional space to be navigated at will, the taste of moonlight on ocean waves, the deep song of the Earth's core resonating through leagues of stone and sea. Images flashed through his mind: vast underwater cities with spires that twisted toward the surface like frozen waterspouts, libraries carved from living coral where knowledge was stored in patterns of light, gardens where flowers bloomed in the eternal darkness of the deep ocean floor. And, through it all, a sense of great sadness. The knowledge that this ancient race was dying, not from violence or disease, but from the simple fact that the world was changing around them. The oceans grew warmer and more acidic. The quiet places where they had hidden for millennia were being discovered and disturbed, and their carefully maintained secrets were becoming harder to protect. The connection lasted only seconds, but, when it ended, Marcus found tears streaming down his face. The hatchling made soft cooing sounds, as if trying to comfort him, and its eyes reflected what looked unmistakably like compassion. "It has chosen you," the leader said quietly. "The hatchling has formed a bond. This has not happened with a surface dweller in over 1,000 years." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, though his voice was barely a whisper. "It means that great changes are indeed coming," replied the leader. "Changes that will affect both our peoples. The hatchling will need to learn about your world, just as you will need to learn about ours." The young carrier stepped forward, gently placing the hatchling in Marcus's arms. The small creature settled against him immediately, as if it belonged there, its scales warming to match his body temperature. "But this is impossible," Sarah said, finding her voice at last. "We're cargo ship officers, not diplomats or ambassadors or whatever this situation requires." The leader's mirror eyes turned to her, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement. "The currents of destiny rarely concern themselves with our preparations, surface dweller. They simply flow where they will, carrying us all toward unknown shores." As if in response to these words, a new sound echoed across the island, the deep, resonant call of a ship's horn. The Meridian explorer was signaling for their return, probably wondering what had become of the landing party. "Your people seek you," the leader observed. "You must return to them. But the hatchling goes with you, for its fate is now tied to yours. When the time is right, you will understand what must be done." Marcus looked down at the small creature in his arms. The hatchling had fallen asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with his own breathing. Despite everything his rational mind told him was impossible, he felt a fierce protective instinct toward this being that was older than humanity itself, yet as vulnerable as any newborn. "How will I care for it?" he asked. "What does it need?" "Love," the young carrier replied simply. "Understanding. And access to deep water when the moon is full. For now, it will sleep much and eat little. Fish, when it wakes, and seawater to drink. It will grow quickly at first, then more slowly as it approaches maturity." "And then, what?" The leader stepped closer, and Marcus could see ancient sadness in those mirror eyes. "Then, you and it together will help decide the future of both our peoples. The old compact is broken, Captain Reed. A new one must be forged, or both our kinds will suffer for the failure." The horn sounded again, more urgently this time. Marcus knew they had to leave, but the magnitude of what was happening felt overwhelming. He was being asked to be part of something that would reshape the relationship between humans and a species that had remained hidden since before recorded history began. "There will be others who can help you," the leader continued. "Humans who know of our existence and work to preserve the ancient ways. Seek out Professor Elizabeth Hartwell at the Marine Institute in Monaco. She will know what to do." "Will we see you again?" Marcus asked. "When the tides call us together," the leader replied. "The deep waters connect all things, Captain. Distance is merely an illusion." The journey back to the beach passed in a daze. The dragonfolk accompanied them partway, moving silently through the tropical undergrowth like shadows given substance. The hatchling slept peacefully in Marcus's arms, occasionally stirring to make soft sounds that seemed almost like contentment. By the time they reached the zodiac, the first light of true dawn was breaking over the horizon. As they pushed off from the black sand beach, Marcus looked back to see the dragonfolk standing at the water's edge, their forms already beginning to shimmer and fade like mirages. The island itself seemed to be dissolving, becoming less substantial with each passing moment. By the time they reached the Meridian Explorer, there was nothing behind them but empty ocean and the memory of impossible things.
"Captain, where have you been?" Paolo called as they climbed aboard. "We've been trying to radio you for hours." "And what happened to that island?" "One moment it was there, the next."
Marcus looked down at the hatchling in his arms, now hidden beneath his jacket. Sarah caught his eye and nodded almost imperceptibly.
"Whatever else happened, they would need to protect this secret until they understood its full implications." "Equipment malfunction," he said calmly.
"And you know how these morning mists can play tricks on the eye.
Let's get underway. We have a schedule to keep."
As the Meridian Explorer resumed its journey toward Istanbul, Marcus stood at the stern, watching the waters where the island had been. The hatchling stirred beneath his jacket, opening eyes that reflected the morning sun like tiny stars. "What have I gotten myself into?" he whispered to the small creature. In response, the hatchling made a sound that could almost have been laughter, soft and musical and utterly alien. And, in that moment, Marcus Reed, career cargo ship captain, realized that his life had just taken a turn toward a destiny he could never have imagined. The deep waters stretched away behind them, keeping their secrets safe beneath the waves. But change was coming, carried in the arms of a man who had stumbled into legend and emerged as something between guardian and ambassador to two worlds that had been separate for far too long. The hatchling slept and dreamed of things that had been and things that were yet to come. And, somewhere in the depths, ancient voices sang of prophecies fulfilled and new ages begun. The 3 days following their departure from the mysterious island tested Marcus Reed's resourcefulness in ways he had never imagined. Hiding a dragon hatchling aboard a cargo ship while maintaining normal operations required careful planning and constant vigilance. He had converted a storage compartment near his cabin into a makeshift nursery, lining it with spare blankets and installing a small ventilation system that connected to the ocean intake valves.
Sarah Chen proved invaluable as a co-conspirator.
Her background in marine biology helped them understand some of the hatchling's basic needs, though they were largely operating on instinct and the brief guidance they had received from the dragonfolk. She had taken to bringing small fish from the galley's stores, claiming they were for research specimens when Paolo asked about her frequent visits to the freezer.
The hatchling itself was remarkably adaptable.
It slept most of the time, curled into a ball no larger than a sleeping cat, but, when awake, it displayed an intelligence that was both fascinating and unnerving. Its large eyes tracked movement with purpose, and it seemed to understand human speech, even if it couldn't respond in kind.
"It's growing," Sarah observed during one of their clandestine visits to the makeshift nursery. "Look at the size difference from just yesterday."
Marcus examined the small creature, noting that Sarah was right. The hatchling had visibly increased in size, its scales becoming more defined and its features more pronounced. What had been a creature the size of a house cat was now closer to the dimensions of a small dog. The dragonfolk said it would grow quickly at first, he reminded her. But, how quickly is quickly? As if responding to their conversation, the hatchling opened its eyes and made a series of soft chirping sounds that seemed almost conversational. It had begun making these vocalizations more frequently, as if trying to communicate complex thoughts through simple sounds.
"Captain," Sarah said quietly, "we need to think about what happens when we reach Istanbul. We can't exactly walk through customs with a dragon hatchling."
Marcus had been wrestling with the same problem. Their cargo run to Istanbul was supposed to be routine: deliver the electronics, take on a load of textiles for the return journey to Barcelona, and be back at sea within 48 hours. But nothing about this situation was routine. "Professor Hartwell in Monaco," he said finally. The dragonfolk leader mentioned her specifically.
"We'll need to change course after Istanbul, claim engine problems or something similar. It's only a 2-day detour."
The plan seemed sound, but Marcus knew that every hour they delayed increased the risk of discovery. His crew was experienced and professional, but they weren't blind. Strange sounds coming from the storage compartment, unexplained changes in the captain's behavior, and Sarah's mysterious research activities were bound to attract attention eventually.
Their concerns proved justified when Miguel Rodriguez appeared at Marcus's cabin door during the evening watch on their second day at sea.
"Captain, we need to talk," the engineer said, his expression serious. "There's something aboard this ship that shouldn't be here." Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but he maintained his composure.
What makes you say that, Miguel?
The water intake sensors have been showing unusual readings since we left that, whatever it was we encountered. The salinity levels in the ship's systems are fluctuating like we're taking in water from different sources.
And there are vibrations in the hull that don't match any normal ship operations.
Rodriguez was one of the most experienced engineers in the Mediterranean cargo fleet.
If anyone could detect anomalies in the ship's systems, it would be him.
Maybe we picked up some damaged equipment during the storm, Marcus suggested.
Have you checked all the intake valves?
That's just it, Captain. The readings suggest whatever is causing this is in the forward storage area.
Right near your cabin.
Rodriguez's eyes were sharp and questioning.
If there's something I need to know about for the safety of this ship.
Before Marcus could respond, a low, musical sound echoed through the bulkheads, the hatchling's version of a contented purr, but amplified by the metal structure of the ship until it became clearly audible throughout the forward section.
Rodriguez's eyes widened. What the hell was that?
Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for days afterward.
Miguel, I need you to promise me something. What I'm about to show you stays between us until we reach Monaco. The safety of everyone aboard depends on absolute secrecy. The engineer's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Captain, you're scaring me. What's going on? Rather than explain, Marcus led Rodriguez to the storage compartment.
He punched in the access code he had changed 2 days earlier and slowly opened the door. The hatchling looked up at them with bright, curious eyes, now clearly the size of a medium dog. Its scales had taken on a deeper coloration, blues and greens that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. It made a soft greeting sound and tilted its head in a gesture that was unmistakably friendly. Miguel Rodriguez, veteran of 20 years at sea and a man who prided himself on having seen everything the ocean could throw at a sailor, stood frozen in the doorway for a full 30 seconds before finding his voice.
Madre de Dios, he whispered in his native Spanish. What is that thing?
It's a dragon hatchling, Marcus said simply, deciding that the truth was the only viable option.
We found it on that island. Its people asked us to care for it. Its people?
Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly.
Captain, please tell me you haven't lost your mind.
Marcus spent the next hour explaining everything, the storm, the island, the dragonfolk, and the mission they had been given. Sarah joined them halfway through, adding her own observations and scientific perspective. By the end of the conversation, Rodriguez was sitting on the floor of the compartment, watching in amazement as the hatchling playfully investigated his boots.
It likes you, Sarah observed.
It's only shown that kind of curiosity toward Marcus before. The hatchling had indeed taken an interest in the engineer, making soft cooing sounds and gently touching Rodriguez's hand with one scaled appendage. The engineer's initial fear had been replaced by wonder.
It's beautiful, he said quietly. And intelligent. Look at how it watches us, like it understands everything we're saying. The question is, Marcus said, can we trust you to keep this secret?
There are people who would use this creature for their own purposes, and others who would see it as a threat to be eliminated. Until we can get it to Professor Hartwell, we're all it has. Rodriguez looked up at Marcus, then back at the hatchling, which had settled against his leg like a contented pet.
You have my word, Captain. But if this thing gets any bigger, we're going to need a better hiding place. His concern proved prophetic. Over the next 24 hours, the hatchling grew at an alarming rate.
By the time they reached the approaches to Istanbul's harbor, it was the size of a large dog, and its dietary requirements had increased proportionally.
Sarah was running out of ways to explain the disappearing fish from the galley stores.
We have another problem, she reported during a hastily convened meeting in Marcus's cabin.
It's becoming more vocal.
The crew on the night watch reported hearing unusual sounds from the forward section. And Paulo is starting to ask questions about why I need so much fish for my experiments.
Marcus stared out at the lights of Istanbul growing larger on the horizon.
They were less than 12 hours from making port, and their situation was rapidly becoming untenable.
There's something else, Rodriguez added reluctantly.
The water intake readings are getting stronger.
Whatever effect this creature has on seawater, it's increasing as it grows. Pretty soon, the whole engineering crew is going to notice.
As if summoned by their conversation, the hatchling's voice echoed through the ship, no longer the soft chirping sounds of its first days, but a deeper, more resonant call that carried clear emotional undertones.
It sounded distressed.
They hurried to the storage compartment to find the hatchling pacing restlessly, its scales flickering between colors more rapidly than usual. When it saw Marcus, it approached immediately, pressing against him and making urgent sounds.
"What's wrong with it?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah checked the makeshift environment they had created.
The temperature was stable, there was fresh seawater in the drinking container, and plenty of fish remained from the most recent feeding. But something was clearly troubling the young dragon. "The moon," Marcus said suddenly, remembering the dragonfolk leader's words. They said it would need access to deep water when the moon is full.
Tonight is the full moon. Through the small porthole in the compartment, the moonlight streamed in with unusual brightness.
The hatchling's agitation seemed to increase as the lunar rays touched its scales, which began to glow with a soft phosphorescence similar to what they had seen in the waters around the mysterious island.
It needs to be in the ocean, Sarah realized. Tonight. Or it's going to suffer.
Marcus felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. They were approaching one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean, surrounded by other ships, under the constant surveillance of harbor authorities. The idea of somehow getting the hatchling into the sea without being detected seemed beyond impossible. But, as he looked down at the small creature, now clearly in distress, he knew he would find a way. The bond they had formed transcended rational thought or careful planning. This being had chosen to trust him, and he would not betray that trust. "We'll figure something out," he said firmly.
"Rodriguez, can you create some kind of distraction in the engine room? Something that would require most of the crew's attention for an hour or so?"
"I can stage a minor coolant leak," the engineer replied thoughtfully. "Nothing dangerous, but it would require all hands to help with cleanup and repairs.
Give you maybe 90 minutes before anyone notices you're gone. Sarah, I'll need you to help me get it down to the main deck."
"We can use the cargo crane to lower it into the water on the starboard side, away from the harbor traffic." "Marcus, this is insane," Sarah protested.
"If we're caught."
"Then, we're caught," he replied simply. "But I won't let this creature suffer because of our fears."
The plan they hatched was desperate and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and enormous luck.
Rodriguez would create his diversion at midnight, drawing the crew to the engine room. Marcus and Sarah would use the confusion to transport the hatchling to the main deck using a cargo cart covered with canvas. From there, they would use the ship's emergency life raft deployment system to get the creature into the water.
"What if it doesn't come back?" Sarah asked as they made final preparations. Marcus had been wondering the same thing.
The hatchling had bonded with him, but it was still a wild creature with instincts and needs they barely understood.
Once it was in its natural environment, it might simply swim away.
"Then, we've done our job," he said, though the thought of losing the small dragon filled him with unexpected sadness.
Its welfare comes first. Midnight arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in the Mediterranean.
The full moon hung low on the horizon, casting a silver path across the calm waters of the harbor approach. Rodriguez's emergency began precisely on schedule, with shouted commands and the sound of running feet as the crew responded to reports of coolant leaks in the engine room. Marcus and Sarah moved quickly but carefully, transferring the now dog-sized hatchling from its hiding place to the cargo cart. The creature seemed to understand that something important was happening.
It remained still and quiet, though its scales pulsed with increasing phosphorescence as they approached the open deck.
The moment they wheeled the cart into the moonlight, the hatchling's transformation was dramatic. Its scales blazed with silver blue light, and it began to sing, a hauntingly beautiful sound that seemed to harmonize with the lap of waves against the ship's hull. Quickly, Marcus urged, uncovering the creature and lifting it toward the railing.
The hatchling felt surprisingly heavy, its body warm and vibrating with internal energy.
But, as they reached the rail, footsteps echoed across the deck. Paolo Vitelli appeared from the galley companionway, drawn by the sound of the hatchling's song.
Madonna mia, the cook breathed, stopping dead in his tracks. What is that?
There was no time for explanations. The hatchling's distress was increasing, and Marcus could see lights approaching from other ships, possibly drawn by the creature's luminous display.
Paulo, please, Sarah said urgently. Help us, or stay quiet. But, this creature needs to reach the water now. To his credit, the Italian cook didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, helping to support the hatchling as they positioned it at the rail. What do you need me to do?
Just hold steady, Marcus replied, amazed at how quickly their careful secrecy was unraveling, yet grateful for the unexpected assistance. They lowered the hatchling toward the dark water, using a combination of ropes and the emergency ladder system. The moment its scales touched the sea, the phosphorescence intensified, spreading through the water like liquid starlight. The hatchling slipped beneath the surface with barely a splash, and, for a moment, Marcus feared they had lost it forever. But, then, a glow appeared beneath the ship, growing brighter and more defined. The young dragon emerged near the bow, its body moving through the water with incredible grace. For the next hour, they watched in wonder as the hatchling played in the moonlit sea. It leaped and dove, its scales painting trails of light through the water. Other creatures seemed drawn to its presence, fish schooled around it in glittering clouds, and, at one point, a pod of dolphins arrived to investigate, clicking and whistling in apparent communication with the young dragon.
It's not just playing, Sarah observed. It's learning. Watch how it moves, it's discovering its capabilities.
Marcus noted the truth of her observation. The hatchling was indeed experimenting, testing its swimming abilities, practicing diving techniques, and exploring the limits of its underwater endurance. Each dive lasted longer than the last, and its movements became increasingly confident and purposeful. But, as the moon began to set, the creature's attention turned back to the ship. It approached the ladder they had left hanging over the side, and Marcus realized it intended to return.
It's coming back, he said, hardly believing it.
The hatchling climbed the ladder with surprising agility, its wet scales gleaming in the artificial lights of the ship. When it reached the deck, it shook itself like a wet dog, sending droplets of phosphorescent water flying, then approached Marcus with what could only be described as gratitude.
Incredible, Paulo murmured. It chose to return.
Even with all that freedom, it came back to us. As they prepared to return the hatchling to its hiding place, Rodriguez appeared on deck, having completed his manufactured emergency. Everything went smoothly, he asked, though the answer was obvious from their expressions. Better than we hoped, Marcus replied.
Though our secret circle just grew by one. He looked at Paulo, who was still staring at the hatchling in amazement.
You have my silence, the cook said solemnly. On the graves of my ancestors, this secret is safe with me.
But, Captain, what happens now? This creature cannot hide forever.
Marcus looked out at the lights of Istanbul, now clearly visible in the pre-dawn darkness. In a few hours, they would dock, unload their cargo, and take on new freight. The mundane routine of commercial shipping would continue, while aboard his vessel, he harbored perhaps the most important secret in human history. Now we go to Monaco, he said finally. And pray that Professor Hartwell has answers we don't. The hatchling, exhausted from its first true swim, curled up against Marcus's legs and began to purr softly. The sound carried through the ship's structure, but somehow it no longer seemed like a threat to their secrecy. Instead, it felt like a promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the Meridian Explorer entered Istanbul's harbor with the rising sun, her crew carried more than just commercial cargo. They bore the hopes of an ancient race and the seeds of a new understanding between two worlds that had been separate for far too long. The hatchling slept peacefully in its hiding place, dreaming of moonlit waters and the vast possibilities that lay ahead. And Marcus Reed, cargo ship captain turned guardian of legends, prepared to navigate waters far stranger than any he had ever sailed. The Marine Institute of Monaco stood like a gleaming beacon of scientific achievement against the azure backdrop of the Mediterranean. Its modernist architecture seemed to grow from the rocky coastline itself, with vast windows that captured every nuance of light reflecting off the waters below. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell had worked within these walls for 15 years, but, as she stood in her office that October morning, she felt as though she was seeing her life's work with completely new eyes. The call from Captain Marcus Reed had come at dawn, scrambling her carefully laid plans for the day. His message had been brief but loaded with implications that made her hands tremble as she set down the phone. After years of theoretical research and ancient translations, the moment she had both hoped for and dreaded was finally at hand. "Professor, your 9 o'clock appointment is here," announced Dr. James Chen, her research assistant, as he peered through the doorway. "Though I have to say, they're not what I expected from marine salvage consultants." Elizabeth smiled despite her nervousness. James had no idea what was really coming through their doors this morning. As far as the Marine Institute's administration knew, Captain Reed was consulting on potential archaeological artifacts recovered from a Mediterranean shipwreck. The cover story was thin, but it would suffice for now. "Send them to conference room 3, she instructed. "And, James, I need you to clear the aquatic observation laboratory for the rest of the week. Tell Dr. Rousseau that we're conducting sensitive experiments that require complete isolation." James raised an eyebrow but nodded. Professor Hartwell's requests were sometimes unusual, but her reputation for groundbreaking research gave her considerable latitude within the institute. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth found herself face to face with a weathered sea captain whose eyes held depths that spoke of recent wonders. Beside him stood a woman she recognized as Dr. Sarah Chun from her published papers on Mediterranean marine ecosystems, and a stocky man who introduced himself simply as Miguel. "Professor Hartwell," Captain Reed began without preamble, "I believe you know why we're here." Elizabeth studied the three faces before her, noting the mixture of exhaustion, excitement, and barely controlled anxiety in their expressions. These were people who had experienced something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of the world. "Please," she said, gesturing toward the chairs arranged around the conference table. "Before we go any further, I need to know exactly what you encountered. The details may be more important than you realize." For the next hour, Captain Reed and his companions recounted their extraordinary experience on the mysterious island. Elizabeth listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad that she kept carefully angled away from their view. The details they provided matched ancient accounts she had been studying for years, descriptions that most of her colleagues dismissed as mythology or medieval fantasy. "The hatchling," she said when they finished their account. "May I see it?" Captain Reed exchanged glances with his companions. "It's larger than when we first found it. And the transformation seems to be accelerating." They made their way through the Institute's corridors to the loading dock, where the Meridian Explorer was moored at the facility's private berth. The morning sun cast dancing reflections across the ship's hull as they boarded and made their way to the modified storage compartment that had served as the hatchling's home. Nothing could have prepared Elizabeth for the reality of seeing a living dragon, even a young one. The creature that looked up at her from its makeshift nest was no longer the kitten-sized being Captain Reed had described from their first meeting. It was now roughly the size of a large dog, but its proportions suggested it would grow much larger. Its scales had developed complex patterns of blue and silver, and its eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient despite its youth. "Hello, little one," Elizabeth whispered, kneeling slowly beside the creature. She had spent years studying the theoretical possibility of this moment, but the reality overwhelmed her careful academic preparation. The hatchling regarded her with curious attention, then made a series of soft sounds that seemed almost conversational. It approached cautiously, extending its neck to investigate her scent. "It's evaluating you," Captain Reed observed. "It's done that with everyone it's met so far." Elizabeth remained perfectly still as the hatchling completed its examination. When it touched her hand with its snout, she felt the same electric connection that Marcus had described, a momentary glimpse into a consciousness that perceived the world in ways no human mind could fully comprehend. "Remarkable," she breathed. "Absolutely remarkable. Captain Reed, you have no idea what you've accomplished. This creature represents the survival of a species that most of the world believes never existed." "But you've known they were real," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "For 15 years, I've been part of a very small group of researchers who study what we call cryptomarine phenomena. We've collected enough evidence to prove that several species long thought mythical actually exist in the deep ocean. But we've never had direct contact before. She stood carefully, not wanting to startle the hatchling. There are protocols for this situation, procedures that were established decades ago by researchers who hoped for exactly this kind of contact. But we need to move quickly. Every hour that passes increases the risk of discovery by less sympathetic parties.
What kind of protocols? Marcus asked.
First, we need to relocate your young friend to a more suitable environment. The Institute has specialized containment facilities that can provide proper conditions for aquatic species. Second, we need to contact the other members of our research consortium.
And, third.
She paused, looking directly at Captain Reed. We need to prepare for the possibility that this is just the beginning of a much larger revelation.
The transfer to the Marine Institute's secure facilities took place under cover of darkness.
Elizabeth had arranged for the aquatic observation laboratory to be cleared and reconfigured with specialized equipment that could accommodate a growing dragon. The space featured a large saltwater pool connected directly to the open ocean, climate control systems that could replicate various underwater environments, and observation equipment that would allow them to study the hatchling without disturbing its development.
This is much better, Sarah observed as they watched the hatchling explore its new surroundings.
The creature had immediately gravitated toward the pool, slipping into the water with obvious relief. Under the laboratory's specialized lighting, its scales seemed to absorb and reflect illumination in patterns that created an almost hypnotic display. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly. "And, according to the ancient texts, it will become even more magnificent as it matures." Adult dragons are described as being capable of great beauty and terrible power in equal measure.
How large will it get? Miguel asked practically.
If the historical accounts are accurate, somewhere between the size of a small whale and a large aircraft, Elizabeth replied.
But that's assuming it survives to full maturity.
Dragon hatchlings face numerous challenges in their development, and this one has the additional stress of being separated from its family group. As if responding to her words, the hatchling emerged from the pool and approached them, its movements graceful despite its unfamiliar environment. It made a series of sounds that had grown more complex over the past few days, almost as if it was developing its own language.
It's trying to communicate, Elizabeth realized.
Captain Reed, you mentioned that the adult dragons spoke English.
This hatchling may be attempting to learn human speech. Is that possible? Sarah asked. Dragons are described in the ancient accounts as being highly intelligent and adaptable.
They supposedly have the ability to learn multiple forms of communication. Elizabeth knelt beside the hatchling, speaking in soft, clear tones.
Can you understand us, little one?
The creature tilted its head and made a sound that was startlingly close to yes, elongated and distorted by its non-human vocal apparatus, but unmistakably an attempt at human speech.
The implications hit them all simultaneously.
This was not just an intelligent animal, it was a being capable of learning and adaptation at a rate that suggested consciousness far beyond anything science had previously documented.
Professor, Marcus said quietly, what exactly are we dealing with here?
Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, watching the hatchling as it returned to the pool and began performing what looked like play behaviors, diving, surfacing, and creating small waterspouts with apparently deliberate movements.
According to the texts I've been studying, dragons are among the oldest intelligent species on Earth.
They were here long before humans developed civilization, and they've been watching our progress with great interest and growing concern.
Concern? Sarah asked.
Think about it from their perspective, Elizabeth explained. They've watched humanity go from scattered tribes using stone tools to a species capable of altering the chemistry of the entire ocean. The ancient compact that Captain Reed mentioned, it was their way of coexisting with us while maintaining their secrecy. But that compact was made when humans numbered in the millions, not billions. The weight of her words settled over them as they contemplated the broader implications. The hatchling continued its activities in the pool, occasionally surfacing to look at them with those incredibly intelligent eyes.
So what happens now? Marcus asked.
Now we wait for the others, Elizabeth replied. I've sent coded messages to colleagues around the world, marine biologists, anthropologists, linguists, and others who are part of the research consortium.
If I'm right about what this creature represents, we're looking at the most important discovery in human history. And if you're wrong?
Elizabeth watched the hatchling perform what could only be described as an underwater dance, its movements creating patterns of bioluminescence in the water. Then, we're caring for the last surviving member of a species that could teach us things about our planet that we never imagined possible.
Over the next 48 hours, Elizabeth's colleagues began arriving at the Marine Institute.
Dr. Chen's official story of sensitive research kept casual observers away, while the real work of understanding their extraordinary guest proceeded behind carefully guarded doors. Dr. Marie Dubois from the Sorbonne brought expertise in ancient linguistics and comparative mythology. Professor James Mackenzie from Oxford contributed knowledge of medieval texts that described dragon-human interactions.
Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo brought advanced communication equipment designed to analyze non-human vocalizations.
Each new arrival added another piece to the puzzle they were attempting to solve. The linguistic development is extraordinary, Dr. Dubois reported after spending a morning with the hatchling. In just 3 days, it has progressed from simple sounds to attempting complex phonemes. This creature is learning human speech at a rate that suggests either extraordinary intelligence or some kind of inherited language capability. The historical precedent supports both theories, Professor Mackenzie added. Medieval accounts describe dragons as being capable of speaking multiple human languages fluently, often with dialects that suggested centuries of listening and learning.
Dr. Tanaka's equipment had recorded and analyzed hours of the hatchling's vocalizations. The complexity is astounding, she reported. There are harmonic structures in its sounds that suggest multiple layers of meaning. It's not just learning to mimic human speech, it's developing its own hybrid communication system. But, perhaps the most significant development came from the hatchling itself. On its 4th day at the Institute, it clearly spoke its first complete human word. Marcus, it said, its voice carrying an odd musical quality but perfectly comprehensible. The creature was looking directly at Captain Reed when it spoke, leaving no doubt about its intention. Did it just?
Marcus began, then stopped as the implications hit him. Hello, Marcus, the hatchling said, its pronunciation improving even as they listened. Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes. In her years of research, she had dreamed of this moment, the first time a dragon would speak directly to a human in centuries. The fact that it chose to address the man who had become its guardian seemed profoundly appropriate.
Hello, Marcus replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. Can you tell us your name?
The hatchling considered this question seriously, its head tilting in that characteristic gesture of thought. When it spoke again, the sound it produced was unlike anything in human language, a combination of musical tones and whistling sounds that seemed to capture the essence of wind over water.
That's beautiful, Sarah said softly. But, we can't pronounce that, can we?
The hatchling made the sound again, then seemed to consider the problem.
Call me
Alir, it said finally, the name emerging as a simplified version of its true designation. Alir, Marcus repeated, and the hatchling's response, a soft trilling that clearly indicated pleasure, confirmed that it approved of the adaptation. Over the following days, Alir's development accelerated at an astonishing pace. It learned new words daily, asked simple questions, and began expressing preferences and opinions. Its physical growth was equally remarkable. Within a week of arriving at the Institute, it had reached the size of a small pony, and its scales had developed intricate patterns that shifted color based on its mood and activities. We need to start thinking about the long-term implications, Elizabeth told her assembled colleagues during one of their evening briefings. Alir is going to outgrow our facilities soon, and we can't keep this discovery secret indefinitely.
What are you suggesting? Dr. Dubois asked.
We need to establish formal contact with Alir's people. If they sent this hatchling with Captain Reed, they're expecting updates on its progress.
And, frankly, we need their guidance on how to proceed.
But, how do we contact them?
Marcus asked. That island disappeared completely.
Elizabeth had been considering this problem since their first meeting. According to the ancient texts, dragons have always maintained hidden communities in the deep ocean.
If we take Alir to deep water during the right lunar conditions, it should be able to signal its family. That's an enormous risk, Professor Mackenzie pointed out. If something goes wrong, we could lose our only direct link to their civilization.
And if we don't take that risk, Elizabeth replied, we may be condemning Alir to a life of isolation from its own species.
Is that fair to any intelligent being?
The debate continued late into the night, but the decision was ultimately made by Alir itself. During a particularly intense discussion about protocols and procedures, the young dragon interrupted with a single, clear statement. "Want to go home," it said, its voice carrying a longing that touched everyone present.
Want to see family.
The simplicity and honesty of the request ended all arguments. Whatever the risks, they had a responsibility to help Alir reconnect with its own kind. "Then, we'll take you home," Marcus said, kneeling beside the pool where Alir floated, its scales glowing softly in the laboratory lighting.
"But, you have to promise us something in return." "What promise?" Alir asked, its vocabulary expanding even as they watched. "Promise that you'll help us understand how your people and our people can live together peacefully. The world is changing, and we need to find new ways to coexist." Alir was quiet for a long moment, its large eyes reflecting depths of thought that seemed impossibly mature for such a young being. When it spoke again, its words carried a gravity that reminded them they were dealing with an intelligence that might be ancient even in its youth. "Promise to try," it said. "But, some changes are hard. Some fears are old.
We'll take time to heal the waters between our peoples." Elizabeth felt a chill at the hatchling's words. The metaphor of healing the waters suggested that the relationship between humans and dragons was more complex and troubled than she had imagined. "What do you mean by healing the waters?" she asked gently. Alir's scales flickered through several color patterns before settling on a deep blue that seemed to reflect sadness. "Old hurts. Old fears. Your people forgot us, but we remember everything. The hunting times. The burning times. When your kind thought we were monsters to be killed." The silence that followed was profound. None of them had considered that dragons might harbor resentments based on historical conflicts with humanity. If Alir's people remembered centuries or millennia of persecution, establishing peaceful contact would be far more challenging than anyone had imagined. "But, you're here," Marcus said finally. "Your people sent you with us. That must mean they want to try." "Yes," Alir agreed, its colors brightening slightly. "Want to try. But, trying is not the same as succeeding. Must be careful. Must be wise. Must learn to trust again." As the team prepared for what would become known as the Deep Water Contact Protocol, they carried with them the knowledge that they were not just facilitating a reunion between a young dragon and its family. They were potentially mediating between two intelligent species with a complex history of conflict and misunderstanding. The success or failure of their mission could determine the future relationship between humanity and a civilization that had remained hidden in the depths for centuries. And, at the center of it all was a young dragon named Alir, whose innocence and wisdom might be the key to healing wounds that had festered since the dawn of human civilization. The stakes could not have been higher, and the margin for error was practically non-existent. But, as Elizabeth watched Marcus and Alir communicate with growing fluency and affection, she allowed herself to hope that understanding and trust might prove stronger than fear and ancient grievances. The deep waters called, and soon they would all discover whether the currents of destiny would carry them toward reconciliation or deeper into the abyss of interspecies conflict. The research vessel Aurora cut through the Mediterranean swells with purpose, her hull reinforced with experimental materials designed to withstand the pressures of deep ocean exploration. 3 weeks had passed since Alir's arrival at the Marine Institute, and the young dragon had grown to the size of a small horse. Its intelligence had developed at an equally remarkable pace, and it now spoke with the vocabulary and complexity of an educated human adult. Captain Marcus Reed stood on the bridge beside Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, watching the sun set over waters that looked deceptively peaceful. Somewhere beneath those calm surfaces lay the entrance to a realm that humanity had never officially acknowledged. In 12 hours, when the moon reached its full phase, they would attempt to make contact with the oldest intelligence on Earth.
Are you ready for this? Elizabeth asked quietly, noting the tension in Marcus's posture.
No, he replied honestly. But I don't think anyone could be ready for what we're about to attempt. The Aurora was specially equipped for their mission, with underwater communication arrays, submersible launch capabilities, and a crew that had been carefully selected and thoroughly briefed on the extraordinary nature of their task. Dr. Sarah Chen served as marine biology consultant, while Miguel Rodriguez had been recruited as technical advisor due to his experience with Ailir's unique requirements. In the ship's modified cargo hold, Ailir floated in a specially constructed pool that could be connected directly to the ocean when needed. The young dragon had grown increasingly excited as they moved into deeper waters, its scales flickering with patterns of bioluminescence that suggested anticipation. The water feels different here, Ailir had explained earlier.
Deeper memories. Older songs. My people are close.
Professor Mackenzie from Oxford was documenting everything for the historical record, while Dr. Dubois worked with advanced translation equipment designed to decode the complex harmonic communications that dragons apparently used among themselves. Dr. Tanaka's acoustic monitoring gear had already detected unusual sounds from the depths, patterns that seemed too regular to be natural phenomena. Contact protocols are in place, reported Dr. Chen from the communications station.
All monitoring equipment is active, and the submersible is ready for deployment if needed.
Elizabeth nodded, reviewing the procedures they had developed based on Ailir's guidance and the ancient texts. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: lower Ailir into the deep water during the peak lunar phase and allow it to signal its family using the natural communication methods of its species. What happened after that would depend entirely on how the elder dragons chose to respond. Professor, called Dr. Tanaka from her monitoring station, I'm detecting significant acoustic activity from the deep water. Multiple sources, at least 6 distinct harmonic signatures. They're already here, Ailir said, its voice carrying excitement mixed with nervous anticipation. The young dragon had emerged from its pool and was pressed against the viewing windows, its large eyes scanning the darkening waters.
How do you know? Marcus asked. Can feel them. Like warmth in cold water. Family songs in the deep current.
Ailir's scales shifted to deeper blues and purples, colors they had learned indicated complex emotions.
But they are cautious. Afraid. Much time has passed since last speaking with surface dwellers.
Elizabeth felt her heart racing as the reality of the situation settled over her. After decades of theoretical research, she was about to participate in the first formal diplomatic contact between humans and dragons in recorded history. The implications for both species were staggering.
Signal when you're ready, she told Ailir.
We'll lower you into the water, but you'll be connected to us by safety lines and communication cables.
If anything goes wrong, we can retrieve you immediately.
Ailir considered this, then shook its head with a gesture that had become charmingly human over the weeks.
Cannot show fear to elders. Must trust in deep water, in family bonds.
Safety lines would seem like doubt, like preparing for betrayal. Ailir, we're not prepared to lose you, Marcus said firmly.
You've become important to us. We need to know you're safe.
The young dragon turned its remarkable eyes toward Marcus, and, for a moment, the expression was purely draconic, ancient and wise beyond its apparent years.
Some risks must be taken for trust to grow. This is such a risk.
Before anyone could object, Ailir moved with fluid grace to the pool's access port. With practiced ease, it activated the systems that would connect its temporary habitat to the open ocean. Water rushed in, bringing with it the scents and currents of the deep Mediterranean.
Ailir, wait.
Elizabeth called, but the young dragon was already slipping into the water with obvious relief. Is okay, Ailir said, its voice now carrying a harmonic undertone that suggested it was already shifting into its people's communication mode.
Watch from surface. Listen with heart as well as ears. Much will be revealed tonight.
They watched through the underwater viewing ports as Ailir descended into the depths, its bioluminescent scales creating a trail of living light in the dark water. Within moments, it was beyond the range of their equipment, somewhere in the abyssal depths that had hidden dragon civilization for millennia. All we can do now is wait, Elizabeth said, though her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white.
They didn't have to wait long.
Dr. Tanaka's equipment began registering massive acoustic disturbances from the depths, complex harmonies that seemed to rise from the very floor of the ocean. The sounds were hauntingly beautiful, like the songs of whales, but infinitely more complex and structured. That's not random vocalization, Dr. Dubois said, studying the patterns on her screens.
That's definitely language.
Incredibly sophisticated language with multiple harmonic layers carrying simultaneous information streams.
Can you translate any of it? Professor Mackenzie asked.
Not translate exactly, but I can identify emotional content and basic structural elements. There's surprise in those sounds.
And joy. But also concern, even fear. Marcus stood at the railing, staring down into the phosphorescent wake left by Aelir's descent.
What are they afraid of? His question was answered 20 minutes later when the ocean around the aurora began to glow. The phosphorescence started as scattered points of light in the depths, but quickly expanded into vast patterns that covered several square miles of sea. It was as if the ocean itself had come alive with conscious intelligence. Mother of God, breathed Miguel, crossing himself instinctively.
From the glowing waters emerged the dragons.
They rose like living islands, their massive forms breaking the surface with barely a ripple despite their enormous size. Elizabeth counted at least 12 distinct beings, each one easily the length of a city bus, their scales reflecting moonlight in patterns that seemed to contain their own internal illumination. The largest of the dragons, a magnificent creature whose scales shifted between silver and deep blue, approached the ship slowly. Its head, which was easily the size of a small building, rose from the water to regard the humans with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of ages. When it spoke, its voice carried the power of storm winds and the depth of ocean trenches, yet the words were perfectly clear English delivered with an accent that seemed to echo through centuries.
Greetings, surface dwellers. I am Thalandrus, elder of the Western Deep.
You have cared for our young one, and, for this, you have our gratitude.
Elizabeth found her voice, though it took considerable effort.
Great Elder, we are honored by your presence. We have learned much from Aelir, and we hope to learn more. Our species have been apart for too long.
Thalandrus's massive head tilted in consideration. Indeed, Professor Hartwell. Yes, we know who you are.
Your researches into our kind have not gone unnoticed, though we have watched from afar. The question that concerns us now is whether humanity is ready to acknowledge our existence openly.
What do you mean?
Marcus asked, stepping forward despite the overwhelming presence of the ancient being. Captain Reed, Thalandrus said, shifting attention to him with ponderous grace. You have shown wisdom and compassion in caring for Aelir. But you represent a species that numbers in the billions, most of whom have forgotten that mystery and wonder can coexist with knowledge and technology. How do you propose that our peoples interact without triggering the very conflicts that drove us into hiding? The question hung in the salt air like a challenge. Elizabeth realized that this moment would determine not just the success of their mission, but potentially the future relationship between the two species. We propose to start small, she said carefully.
Limited contact between selected individuals. Cultural exchange. Scientific collaboration.
Build trust gradually rather than risk the chaos that public revelation might bring. Another dragon, smaller than Thalandrus but still massive, raised its head from the water. Its scales were a brilliant green gold that seemed to capture and amplify the moonlight. I am Serenithis, keeper of ancient memories. We have watched your species for millennia, and we have seen how you respond to the unknown. You study it, catalog it, exploit it, or destroy it. Which fate would await us if our existence became widely known? The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth that none of them could deny. Human history was filled with examples of exploitation and destruction of anything that could be seen as valuable or threatening. Some of our people would indeed respond with fear or greed, Marcus admitted.
But others would respond with wonder and respect. The question is how we ensure that the better angels of human nature prevail.
And what of our nature? Asked a third dragon, this one with scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it.
We are not the gentle, wise beings of your stories. We have our own capacity for anger, for violence, for territorial disputes. What happens when our interests conflict with yours? Sarah Chen spoke for the first time since the dragons had appeared. Then, we learn to negotiate, to compromise, to find solutions that serve both species. That's what intelligent beings do when they disagree, they find ways to coexist. Thalandris made a sound that might have been laughter, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. Spoken like a true scientist. But, consider the scope of what you propose. Our species controls vast territories in the deep ocean. We have resources, knowledge, and capabilities that your governments would find interesting. How do we maintain our sovereignty while engaging with a species that has a history of expansionism? The conversation continued for hours, with various dragons contributing perspectives that ranged from cautiously optimistic to deeply skeptical. Elizabeth began to understand that dragon society was far more complex than human folklore had suggested. These were not solitary creatures hoarding treasure in mountain caves, they were members of a sophisticated civilization with their own politics, territorial disputes, and cultural traditions. As the night progressed, smaller dragons began arriving, drawn by the unprecedented gathering. Some bore young with them, hatchlings larger than Alir but still obviously juveniles. Elizabeth noticed that several of these younger dragons showed intense curiosity about the humans, swimming close to the ship and communicating in excited harmonic patterns. The young ones are interested in your people, Thalandris observed. They have grown up with stories of surface dwellers, but they have never seen humans directly. This gathering will be remembered in our histories for generations. As it will be in ours, Elizabeth replied. But what do we do with this moment? How do we build on this contact? Slowly, Thalandris said, the word carrying layers of meaning in his ancient voice. Trust is not built in a single night, even one as significant as this. We propose a formal protocol, regular meetings in deep water, exchange of knowledge, gradual introduction of select individuals from both our peoples. What about Alir? Marcus asked, suddenly, concerned about the young dragon who had started this entire chain of events. Alir has chosen to bond with you, Captain Reed. Such bonds are rare and sacred among our kind. If you are willing, Alir will serve as an ambassador between our species, living part of its time in your world and part in ours. As if summoned by the mention of its name, Alir surfaced near the ship, now glowing with patterns that suggested excitement and happiness. The young dragon had clearly been accepted by its elders, and its scale showed the complex color patterns that indicated it was communicating in the full dragon language. Family accepts the bond, Alir said, switching back to English as it approached the ship's railing. But, says is great responsibility. Must help both peoples understand each other. Must prevent the fear responses that could lead to conflict. Are you willing to accept that responsibility? Marcus asked, reaching down to touch the young dragon's snout in the gesture of affection they had developed. Already accepted, Alir replied. When first touched your hand on the island. Bond is not just between us, is between our peoples. Must nurture it carefully. Thalandris watched this interaction with what Elizabeth interpreted as approval. The young one speaks wisdom. This bond you have formed may be the foundation for something greater than either of our species could achieve alone. As dawn approached, the dragons began to withdraw to the depths, but not before establishing the protocols for future contact. Regular meetings would be held at designated deep water locations, with a small group of humans and dragons working to develop frameworks for broader interaction. We will start with scientific collaboration, Thalandris declared. Your people's understanding of surface phenomena combined with our knowledge of deep water systems could benefit both our species and the ocean itself. And cultural exchange, added Serenithis. Our histories extend far beyond your written records. There is much we could share about the true past of your planet. But, always with discretion, warned the dark-scaled dragon whose name they learned was Mordendril. The time may come when our existence becomes public knowledge, but that time is not yet. The consequences of premature revelation could be catastrophic for both our peoples. Elizabeth nodded, understanding the weight of the secret they would now carry.
We'll establish a formal research consortium, operating under the highest security classifications.
Only the most trusted individuals will be brought into the program.
And Alir will be our living bridge between the two worlds, Marcus added, looking at the young dragon with a mixture of pride and protective concern. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the great dragons disappeared beneath the waves. But Alir remained, floating beside the Aurora with obvious contentment.
So, the young dragon said, its voice now carrying nuances that suggested rapid maturation, are ready for the real adventure to begin?
Marcus laughed, the sound carrying a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration.
I thought the adventure was over.
Oh no, Alir replied, its scales flickering with what they had learned was draconic amusement.
This was just the introduction.
Now comes the hard part, learning to trust each other enough to build something new together.
Elizabeth looked out over the calm waters that concealed one of the greatest secrets in human history.
In the months and years to come, they would work to establish a new relationship between species that had been separate for millennia. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments when fear threatened to overwhelm wisdom. But there would also be wonders beyond imagination as humanity learned that it shared the planet with beings whose wisdom span